Hello, everyone. My name is Gil Penalosa, and this is Cities for Everyone, a webinar where every other Tuesday I invite fascinating people to share their stories, as it will help all of us, passionate advocates, create more equitable, sustainable, playful cities where everyone will be able to live healthier and happier. Today, we have a fascinating guest with very interesting story. Sarah. Sarah, welcome. Sara Stace is from Sydney, Australia. It's 1 a.m. Thanks, Sarah, for coming live at 1 a.m. Australia. It's 11 a.m. the day before in Toronto. And Sarah's president of Better Streets, an NGO that she created. She's also the head of cities at WSP in Australia. She has worked in the public sector, the private sector, the NGOs, and she is going to present today on Better Streets for everybody. Everybody's separate because she's talking about all people, people that walk or bike or skate or take public transit or cars, or people with disabilities, young and old and rich and poor and all backgrounds. Sarah, thank you very, very much for having accepted the invitation. And please, we have hundreds and hundreds of people from all over the world. We want to learn from you. Better streets for everybody. Sarah, as you saw when people were signing in, we have people from all over the world, Qatar, Portugal, all over the US, Australia. So all of us are here because we are eager to learn from you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gil, for having me on this show. I'm really pleased that you've invited me. Thank you very much. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. Just before I do, you'll note the image behind me here is of Taylor Square in Sydney, and it's got a rainbow crossing. And this is where the annual Mardi Gras is held every year. I think it's one of the biggest Mardi Gras in the world. So I'm going to, without any further ado, I'm going to share my screen. I presume that's working now. So hi everyone, my name is Sara Stace and I'm presenting today on Better Streets Are for Everybody. And I've deliberately separated the two because we're really thinking about how a street can be welcoming for people of young and old, people with disability, and so on. We want everybody to be welcome on our streets. I work for WSP in Australia, and as Gil said, I'm also the president of Better Streets and also the treasurer of the World Cycling Alliance. And I'll tell you about those in just a moment. Before I do, though, that needs to move forward. I'm joining you today from the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to elders past and present on land that has never been ceded. And the history of our Indigenous people goes back some 60,000 years in Australia. So today I'm going to cover three key things. I'll talk a little bit about myself and what I do. And then I want to talk about, I guess, some of the amazing things we've had happen in Sydney and some of the things that have been incredibly hard. And so I think often we hear from all the success stories, but I wanted to talk also about some of our failures, some of the things that haven't worked, because we recognize that changing streets is so incredibly difficult. And so I really wanted to bring that to this topic today. What are some of the really wicked problems, the problems that are very hard to unravel because they're so multifaceted? And then how do we solve some of those? What are the things I've learned over about 30 years of working? How do we make an impact from the bottom up? So very quickly about myself is I lived in a third world country in Papua New Guinea, which is just to the north of Australia for my first 9 years. And that was very formative for me around, I think, how I think about streets and community. And also, I guess, my sense of equality and justice was very ingrained in me from a very young age. My parents were both working as doctors there. And up in the top right-hand corner is my father, who is a doctor. And he decided just before he turned 80 that he wanted to ride across Australia. That's some 5,000 kilometres from the Indian Ocean to the Pacific Ocean, all by himself. So he hopped on an e-bike. I joined him for about 20% of that, the first 800 kilometres, and then the last bit from Canberra. And there he is with his dipping his front wheel into the Pacific Ocean down at the famous Bondi Beach. And so I thought, I don't want to be outdone by my dad. And so just before I turned 50, I decided to run my first marathon. And that's me in a Wonder Woman costume. I love running. I just did use that costume to run in the city to surf, which goes from the CBD to Bondi Beach. That's only 14 kilometers, but I'll be doing the marathon in a couple of weeks' time. My other love is my children, and that's them there a few years ago in the back of the cargo bike doing what we always do in Sydney, which is riding to the beach. And then that's with my team here in Sydney working with me at WSP. So that's a little bit of my background. Then what I work on. So my very brief background is that I started university in 1991. I started architecture. I was very young. I was only 16, which I think if I went my time again, I would start later. But I registered as an architect and then I did an MBA, went into a property fund where I was the general manager of a stock exchange listed fund, but it really wasn't my happy place. It wasn't until I found my true passion, which is improving lives through the built environment. That is where I wake up every day, and this is what I just absolutely love doing, as you'll see. So I was very lucky to get a job with the Australian government as the Director of National Urban Policy. And there we wrote the National Urban Policy on the left there. Then we created the first national urban design protocol for Australia called Creating Places for People, and then wrote the first active transport policy for the Australian government as well. And I was very lucky to then be invited later to write two policy documents for United Nations because the UN SDGs requires countries to have a national urban policy. And then I've since worked in local and state government in walking and cycling strategies, and now at WSP, where I work on cities and place. So that's, I guess, a very quick background about me because I wanted to give you the context of all these years working in the space of cities and so on. What have I learned from that? And I'll come back to those lessons later. What I like to do in my spare time, in addition to running, is I'm on the board of the World Cycling Alliance. I'm the treasurer, and essentially, I think there'll be a few of us, the board members, joining on today. So I hope to see you afterwards when we have a chat about it. But essentially, we're a not-for-profit organisation that's registered in Belgium. We sit alongside the European Cycling Federation, or Cyclist Federation, sorry, and we represent non-government bicycle advocacy organisations from all around the world focused on everyday cycling and micromobility. And I guess our aim is that we believe in that power of unity. You're going to hear this over and over in my presentation. We're here to amplify that message about the benefits of cycling and to bring about that change at a global scale. So these are some of our board members. We've got one representative from every continent, and we represent over 100 member cycling organisations around the world. And if you are in a cycling organisation and you're not a member, then please get in contact with us through that website. I'm also the president of an Australian charity organisation called Better Streets. And similarly, we are there to connect and educate and empower our coalition members. And I'll show you some of those members later. We've got over 100 members. And what we're trying to do is make the more effective, scalable action to improve our streets. And just so that you can see that there on the right-hand side, you can see one of our surf lifesavers has come to grab a little bit of a sandwich on their way down to the beach to be there to help people to be safe in the surf. The bottom left, we have outdoor dining parklets that were put in right next to the city during COVID. And so we're really learning to take over our streets, and that's a summer festival in the left there. And that's where we'll close the streets to traffic and open it to people. And this here is, I guess, Better Streets. We have 5 key recommendations. So we want better streets that get kids active, and we want to get more kids walking and cycling to school. We used to have about 75% would catch public transport, walk or cycle. We've gone down a lot since then. So we want to get them back to that level. We wanted streets that are easy to cross, and to do that, we need to have a lot more pedestrian crossings. We want streets that slow vehicles down, and we really are aiming for 30 kilometres an hour, which is the survivable speed limit for if someone's hit by a car. We want better streets that boost local businesses. And as the diagram that I showed you before with those various outdoor dining parklets is what we're talking about to help local businesses to thrive. And we want streets that are safe and easy to ride by building safe cycling infrastructure. So there are 5 key asks that our coalition members are all centered around. But fundamentally, we do face some really wicked problems. And what I mean by a wicked problem is one that has a lot of factors and they're interwoven with each other and often changing over time as we get a lot of technology and change. We see that these things are difficult to face, and therefore it's really difficult to understand what is the root cause of that and resolve it in any meaningful way. And so I'm going to give you 3 examples of what a wicked problem is. This one here is very worrying for a lot of us. If you haven't seen this diagram before, this is the sea surface temperature of the ocean. Now, if you remember from your physics classes, water is a heavy mass, and heavy masses are very hard. They take a lot of energy to heat up. And so the fact that the Earth's oceans have suddenly leapt up in temperature over the last 12 months is very, very worrying. In fact, it's been about 18 months. And so the pink band that I'm showing there is the difference between the 2022 levels and the most recent readings. So some of those show the 2023 and 2024, but that is 12-month anomaly. And that is really, really frightening when we look at the implications for the planet. And that really worries me, as with many of us. The second wicked problem is our planetary boundaries. Now, what we mean by that, and 6 out of the 9 boundaries that have been assessed have been exceeded. What we mean by this is that our Earth cannot sustain these changes to all of our various resources and systems. So, an example was many years ago, we realized that ozone was being destroyed. And so that was going to have impacts. That had a very big impact in Australia because it meant that it was very easy to get sunburnt. There was no UV protection. And we've come back from that by stopping the CFCs from our aerosol sprays. So that actually has come back. And that's your ozone depletion in the top right-hand corner. We've done very well on that. And we can show it can be done. But other things, novel entities, is things like microplastics in our oceans and obviously climate change. So I think this is really worrying. And a lot of this comes through our consumer culture that is encouraging us to continue to use more and more resources. So we need to be thinking not just of climate, but of all of those various aspects of our biosphere. And I would argue that our third wicked problem is streets. Changing streets is really hard. And I've created a little diagram on the right-hand side there, which is a bit of a joke, I know. But essentially, this is the hardness scale that they use for gems. And it starts with talc and it goes down to diamonds. And even harder than that is to remove car parking from our streets. And even more hard than that is to add bicycle lanes. But really, motonormativity is a phrase that gets used a lot now. And that is essentially where we cannot see a world without cars. We tend to really think of cars are essential to us. They dominate our streets, but we don't even notice. An example of that is that we have 1,200 people a year die in Australia from being hit by a car. And yet we will react far more strongly if someone's eaten by a shark. We only have about 3 people killed a year by shark, but we react much more strongly. And that's even though only 35% of people in Australia can't drive because they're too old or they're too young, they don't have their driver's license yet, they're living with a disability, or they may choose not to drive because they can't afford or they just don't want to. So I think that it's really hard to change that because providing for cars has been really there for 80 years now, and we need to turn that around. I think another aspect that makes it really difficult is that there are many agencies responsible for that. And so I'll go into those in a moment. And of course, the old trope, we're not Amsterdam. And then more recently, well, we're not Barcelona either. And well, we're not Bogota. And as we saw with the Paris Olympics, we're not Paris and we're not Beijing, our nearest neighbor, who are aiming to be the next Netherlands in the next 10 years. So we're always finding excuses for not changing. And so that's what I wanted to concentrate on for the rest of this presentation, this webinar, is how do we make that change? But before that, I'm going to start with a failure that we had in Sydney. So on the left there, we can see a cycleway in College Street in Sydney. You can see the building behind is St Mary's Cathedral. And in 2015, we had to have a mass protest, a die-in with all the bike riders with their bikes and bodies in the middle of the cycleway to say we don't want to have this removed, and they removed it anyway. And so that was a real failure for us in Sydney of trying to get rid of something that was safe cycling infrastructure. But I'm very pleased to say in 2023, that same building behind the cathedral, we had our Minister for Cities and Active Transport, Rob Stokes. He hopped on a bicycle to commemorate the reopening of that cycleway, and it's still there today. And so that was a real success. How did we get there? And that, I guess, is the real question. What does it take to get this? And so this here is a diagram that came from the Dutch Cycling Embassy. They talk about having hardware, which is the infrastructure. And on the left there, you can see Fiona Campbell. She is an absolute champion of cycling in Sydney in Australia. And in fact, I think she's really met many friends and colleagues globally that she's familiar with. So I'm sure she'll say hello to you. But that's on a bicycle on one of our rainbow cycleways. So that is the hardware. The software is the things like the strategies and the guidelines and the funding, and we need that in order to get to the hardware. But there's a third element. And when you're a bureaucrat, I worked for 15 years as you saw, with the different 3 levels of government. The bureaucrat cannot create the orgware. That is the political support, the community support, and the advocacy that needs to be there to say, this is what we want. And it needs to have a positive, loud support for change with a clear message. And when you get the successes, like I just showed you with Rob Stokes, that as soon as he got off his bicycle, we presented him with a huge card of saying thank you, signed by hundreds of members of our community. And so that orgware is what I want to talk about. But you can see here, this is Sydney in 2024. You saw that photograph of 2015. This is what changed in the 7 years. We built pop-up cycleways during COVID. We got outdoor dining and doubled our cycling network. We got a Minister for Active Transport. That was the Rob Stokes that you saw, and so on. And I've color-coded these against those 3 elements of hardware, software, and orgware. So, my lesson is, first of all, no one is too small to make a difference. And that comes from Greta Thunberg, who obviously, as a very small young woman, has made a massive change all over the world. And so we have lessons to learn from her. I'm going to draw from Greg Settle. He has written a book called Cascades, How to Create a Movement that Drives Transformational Change. So my next few slides are going to be based on what I read from his book. I have amended it slightly, but this is essentially the lessons that I took away from that. The first is for the building blocks of change, he talks about 3. One is that you have to have a clear vision for fundamental change. You need to articulate very clearly what success looks like. The second key element he talks about is that you need to appeal to the majority of people. You need to have a broad spectrum of allies who relate to others. Now, the reason why that matters, as we'll see later, is that in order to get to that tipping point, you need to have the majority of people come through and want to and vocalize that change. And the third key element he talks about is creating coalitions that create a pillars of support, and they need to come from all sorts of different areas, from government to industry, academia, and community organizations. So I'll go through each of those step by step. The first one is having a clear vision for change. So I showed you before this diagram about what we want for better streets, but we also have, sitting alongside that, we've got success measures. So I mentioned some of those when I was talking. We want to have things like 75% of school trips for active kids. We want 20 crossings a year for every municipality. We want to get to a default 30-kilometre speed limit. We want the outdoor dining and street festivals, and we want to build 100 kilometres a year of new cycling infrastructure. So if you can articulate exactly what those are, then as you start to progress towards success, you can then celebrate that. And I think that's a really important component, and you've got your sights very clearly set on what we want to achieve. The second one, and this is going to take me a little while to explain, but again, this is coming from Greg Sertel. It's from his threshold model. I tried to make a bit of a diagram of what I think that meant for me. So the main one is we all are familiar, I hope, with the idea that you get your early adopters through to your late adopters. But this I've changed to being about advocacy. So on the left-hand side, we have people like myself, the passionate advocates who are sort of shouting with their candle in the dark. And we really want to have that change and we have a vision. That's wonderful, but we might appeal to some of the more interested, but there is a chasm where we need to bridge that into the tipping point, and that might be somewhere between the 10, 15, or 20% of the population. And so Satel talks about the fact that your early adopters need to reflect and be connected to the general community. They need to see themselves in you. And I think one of the problems we certainly have in Australia, and I think this is the case in many areas where we don't have a lot of cycling, the bike riders are those passionate advocates and the enthused, fearless, and so on. But the general population who I've put here as the neutral or even oblivious really don't see themselves as cyclists. And I think that can apply for all sorts of things. People who really want to have safer streets, well, most people are pretty oblivious to that. They just accept through motor normativity that this is perfectly normal, that we have so many people dying on our streets. And so I think that's the lesson I got away from that, is that people in those higher thresholds of skepticism need to feel attracted to the cause and hear it from multiple trusted sources. And I thought this quote from Ruth Bader Ginsburg really sums that up. She says, "Fight for the things that you care about, but do it in a way that will lead others to join you." Now, this is a pretty complex diagram, so I hope I can do it justice. I came up with this as a bit of my theory of the circles of influence. So this is really coming from my many years working in all three levels of government and in the private sector. I've tried to do a bit of a diagram about how I see this working. Now, of course, this is very simplified and it may only apply in certain contexts, but I'll give it a go. So I'm going to start with the community advocates at the top. And essentially, our role, what we do is we ask for change, we provide the evidence, and we tell those community stories. Now, this is really important. When I was working in one of my government roles, and when I left, I asked a senior executive, I said, where did I go wrong? Where could I have made a much bigger difference? It was a major cycling infrastructure work, and it didn't get through. And I said, what could I have done better? And he said, look, Sarah, you've done all the right things. If you think back to those that diagram from the Dutch Cycling Embassy, you've created all of the evidence, you've built the business cases, you've prepared all the guidelines, but what you couldn't get is the politicians on side because they needed to get the community support. And as a bureaucrat, you can't do that. That must come from the community. And so I really took that lesson away. And that was one of my main reasons for joining with Better Streets as a co-founder, to get that up and running, because it was a really big lesson for me. So we need to tell the community stories. We need to engage with those other stakeholders on this map and support the change. This is really important. When a politician does the right thing that you've asked for, you need to get in and really, really vocally back them up. And I'll give some examples of that in a moment. And as I showed with Rob Stokes, our active transport minister, we gave him the big card to show that vocal support. For the politicians, their role is to set that vision and to prioritise and decide based on all of the information in front of them and the recommendations, to instruct the government staff on what they need to do, legislate and fund projects. And then the government staff have two main avenues they need to pursue. One is they work with industry, where they'll procure projects and set the guidelines, and they might consult with them on what is best practice. And with the general community, they need to engage with them and consult and obviously deliver that infrastructure on their behalf. The general community, I think, have two roles. So one is that they can directly contact those politicians and ask for change. They give their feedback, and that can be positive and negative. And obviously, importantly, they vote. If they like something that a politician's done, they'll vote for them. If they don't like it, they won't vote for them. and they're represented by us as the community advocates. So I guess that's my little circle of influence. I'm very happy to receive any feedback on how to improve that. But I just wanted to give this quote here from Lee Waters, who's been visiting in Australia. And he says, "We all have to act. This is distributive leadership." So on the other hand, oops, let's just move that forward. What are the motivations? It's always really important to understand what motivates people. And so in bold, I put what I think is the key motivator, followed by a couple of other dot points. So the community advocates, we have that vision. We want that change for the better, but we don't always see the full view. And that's, I guess, that part where we need to bridge the chasm and really understand where the majority of people are coming from and what it takes to convince them. For the politicians, obviously, they are very motivated by wanting to be re-elected. That's really important to them. They want to hear that positive feedback. And importantly, they want to be accepted by the majority. They're not going to get voted back in if they're not accepted by that majority. And if they're at the end of their term, they might be willing to burn some of that political capital. For the government staff, importantly, they want to keep their job. There's nothing cynical about that. We all want to keep our jobs or even to get that promotion. And so they often don't want to put their neck out. I can say that as 15 years as a bureaucrat. And they want to get their funding for their projects and they want to keep things easy. That's again a very natural human instinct. For the industry, they want to get projects. That's really important for them that they win projects from government. They need to make a profit because that's how they keep their business afloat. And they need to keep their staff employed. That's all very important and key factors. The general community, I would argue, they do have aspirations. They do want to get out and have a wonderful, active life and live this happy, sunny lifestyle. But fundamentally, they don't really like change all that much. And they are very dependent on their cars in large part. And then, so that sort of completes that circle, I suppose, of what are those various motivations. And if we come back to this diagram, those thresholds of resistance, keep in mind that it's the neutral and oblivious, those the silent majority that you need to convince that those people need to be the ones who present to the politicians in their electorate. They need to be ordinary people who represent the majority. So the perception from the politician has to be, oh, well, this, I'm not sure I understand this idea, but I can see the majority of people support it because I've got a representative who's from there. And so you really don't want to have the passionate advocates like me present to the politicians. You want the vast majority of people to be as if they're represented. Now, another pillar of there was creating, the third pillar was around creating coalitions around united around a vision. And so here, this is an example from Better Streets that we've got over 100 organizations coming from all sorts of different areas, from parents who are concerned about climate change to cycling organizations to places that want to have street improvements to major businesses, walking groups and architects and so on. We've got a very broad group of present people who are active members. But you need to also court groups who haven't joined that movement. But most importantly, you need to find the allies who are unlikely to be allies because that will get their interest. An example is back in when the politician that removed that cycleway in 2015, that same politician wanted to make it compulsory to have a driver's license in order to be on a bicycle. And so we went and approached the Shooters and Fishers Party because they're libertarians and said, would you support us? And they did. So you need to find those unlikely allies in order to get that support. And then once you have all of those building blocks in place, then you need to learn how to listen and act. So, firstly, you need to build the evidence from research and case studies, and we're generally pretty good at that. We go and get the evidence out there, and we present that evidence. And again, as a bureaucrat, that was very much in the purview of my job. We also need to listen to what others have to say, and that's why I put the listening before talking, because we need to listen what they have to say, what their experience is as a person on the street, an ordinary person, and what their knowledge and wisdom is. We need to tell stories in relatable ways to each different audience. This is really important that we tailor that messaging to how people are most likely to be receptive. And the other one, I love this quote from Christiana Figueres. She was the Christiana Figueres, sorry. She was on the COP who got the Paris Agreement through. And her words were, I'm not a pessimist nor an optimist, I'm an actionist. It's important that we not just complain about things, we need to actually take action. And so at the moment in Australia, we are very, very lucky to have Lee Waters out here. He's a politician from Wales, and he was the former Deputy Climate Change Minister and the Transport Minister. And he has an incredible story to tell where he brought in 30 kilometres an hour in Wales. He's also faced an enormous backlash against that. And I think that's taken a huge toll on him. And we, about a year ago, hatched a plan to get him out to Australia, and we're very pleased he's still here. These are some of the audience he's been to visit. He's been to Perth, Sydney, Canberra. He's on his way to Adelaide and then Melbourne. And these are photographs of all different events. We've got him in front of young professionals who are just starting out in their planning career or their transport career. We went to Parliament House in Australia. We can see all those happy smiles there. We went to major town hall events where we had three different politicians from very different areas of life come and present their war stories. We presented to traffic engineers, again, to all sorts of different parliamentarians of different parts of government, and also at conferences. So I guess we're using this moment to try and create a movement or a tipping point for us in Australia and share that message. And each one of those is tailored very much to that audience. So over to you. I'm ready to take questions.
And this is the last question. We always end asking our guests, what would be your call to action? Here you got hundreds of people from all over the world, from multiple backgrounds, who want to get things done. It's not just an academic exercise. And I love how you mentioned 1 out of 3 people do not drive, and that's everywhere. In even in the wealthiest neighborhood, 1 out of 3 do not drive. So when people say, "Oh, I don't want walking because I don't even want sidewalks because everybody drives," no, that's not. But what would be your call to action to end this magnificent? I wish we had 2 hours with you, but maybe not you because now it's 2 o'clock in the morning in Sydney. But thank you very, very much, Sarah. And please give us your call to action.
Well, I think my whole presentation has been a big call to action. Hopefully, I think that my key takeaway would be go out there and find your allies, and think about how your message is going to be amplified. How do you amplify your message by working with others and working together around the things that you agree on? You may not agree on 100%, but that doesn't matter. That's completely irrelevant. Find that resonance and amplify the message with everybody. I think that's my call to action.
Wonderful. I think that if we develop alliances on better streets with people that care about heart or healthy air or mental health or economic development or many others, the more allies that we get, I think the more successful. You have provided so many amazing ideas that I hope that everybody will share the video with as many, with the media, with advocates, with elected officials, with everybody. And I invite Sarah and everyone, 2 weeks from today, we are going to have climate change for everyone. Thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you very much, everyone who connected today. And we'll see you in 2 weeks. Take care.
Thank you. All right. Bye bye.
Sarah, thank you, thank you, thank you. What a wonderful presentation. It was amazing. You provided so many examples and tools that everyone that watches the presentation can share. It becomes useful because we can share with elected officials, with decision makers, commissioners, secretaries, ministers, advocates, with the media, with community groups, with anyone that wants to create better streets for everybody. Sarah, thank you very much. And I hope that everyone who watches will use this to not only to enhance knowledge, but to become more active because we do need better streets for everybody everywhere. Thank you very much. And I'll see you 2 weeks from today.